Good evening and welcome to QTX Real World Futures. I'm Professor Melinda Edwards and it is my pleasure to be your tour guide for our exciting journey into the future this evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara as the nation's first owners of the land upon which we meet this evening. We acknowledge that these have always been a place of teaching, learning and research, and QT acknowledges the very important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within our university community. Now tonight, we at QTX are very excited to be joining with QUT's ARC Centre for Excellence, Automated Decision Making and Society, and all of the delegates from their research symposium who are on campus at the moment. So welcome this evening to our studio audience. We also have about 300 people attending online this evening. So for those of you who haven't met us before, we are QTX. Our business is executive education, and we bring together our deep discipline expertise from across the university's faculties, and we bring them to you, our community. And we inform corporate and government education programs. In this program, we go even further by exploring the future and bringing our experts' insights into what it is that we're likely to find in the future to help our community to grapple with those issues. It also allows us to learn from you through your questions and perspectives, enabling us to fulfill our mandate as a truly civic university. So welcome, and we look forward to your contributions later. Now, how will this evening work? I'm about to introduce our expert, Professor Axel Bruns. And then during Axel's presentation, my excellent colleague, Adam Lenihan, is going to be collating any questions that you might have if you're watching online, if you would like to enter them into the chat forum. So if you can enter them there, Adam will have a look at those, he'll theme them and present a representative cross-section of them on your behalf during the question and answer session that will follow Axel's presentation. Now to why we're all here, to hear from our expert on the impact of digital media in society, Professor Axel Bruns, who will be sharing his insights on societies on the brink, understanding the dynamics of partisanship and polarisation. Professor Bruns' formal bio reveals that he is an ARC Laureate Fellow and Professor in the Digital Media Research Centre here at QUT, and we are very lucky to have him. He's also a Chief Investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. His books include Are Filter Bubbles Real?, Gate Watching and News Curation, Journalism, Social Media and the Public Sphere, and the edited collections Digitising Democracy, the Routledge Companion to Social Media and Politics, and Twitter and Society. His current work focuses on the study of user participation in social media spaces, such as Twitter, and its implications for our understanding of the contemporary public sphere, drawing especially on innovative new methods for analysing big social data. But who is the man behind all those achievements? Well, Axel tells me he grew up in West Germany during the Cold War and spent time in an electronic warfare unit in the German army, listening in to Soviet army communications during the time the Berlin Wall came down. He originally planned to become an astrophysicist and in fact studied physics for 2 semesters. And you're going to love this one, when he first presented his PhD project in the mid-90s, a senior academic at the university where he was at the time, who shall remain nameless, asked him, "I've looked at the internet and it doesn't look very nice. Why would anyone want to study it?" He tells me he's still trying to formulate an appropriate answer. Today, Professor Bruns is going to focus on the dynamics of the spread of mis- and disinformation across online and offline media and propose that we must pay more attention to the social rather than technological factors that intensify polarisation into the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, buckle your seatbelts for another wild ride, and please join me in welcoming Professor Axel Bruns to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and it's wonderful to be here and speak to you all, as well as to the folks online on Zoom. Welcome and thank you for coming along. I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet, the Turrbal and Yagara people and their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, learning, and research. This talk is in some ways an agenda-setting talk. As we've just heard, I was exceedingly lucky to win an Australian Laureate Fellowship in the last round, which is a very significant honor. It is the first time one of these fellowships was awarded to someone in the field of media and communication. That Laureate Fellowship will start early next year. So really what I'm presenting here is essentially the work that's led me up to this point, as well as the work that now needs to be done in order to take this further and commence this Laureate Fellowship. So this is a call to action. This is a statement of intent, if you like, based on where we are at this point. I have, as you see, called this Societies on the Brink, which may seem a little bit sensationalist and over the top, but if you want an example, and I apologize, I might, I guess, say there's a trigger warning here. If you want an example of what a society on the brink looks like, it looks something like this. You can't get much more on the brink than having an armed mob storm your place of government and threaten to hang the vice president. So this is what we are talking about when we are talking about societies on the brink. This is, of course, in many ways a product of deep polarization and hyperpartisanship, not just recently, but over many years, and possibly deepening polarization and hyperpartisanship, of course. Now, we might say this is just the US and we're nowhere near this. Well, we are nowhere near this. We're not at this point, but we do see scenes like this, of course, just recently, just a few weeks ago in Melbourne. And we've seen similar protests for some time now. In fact, you could go back to the Cronulla riots, you could go back to other events like this in Australia and elsewhere around the world as well. I'm not showing these simply as kind of disaster porn or a way to say that everything's falling apart and that the breakdown of society is inevitable, but we are seeing these kinds of scenes quite frequently. We're seeing these kinds of scenes quite frequently. There is, I guess, a question to whether we're actually seeing them more frequently in recent times than we have perhaps ever before. So this again is, of course, an example of the kind of protests that we're seeing. We're seeing here also the kinds of themes and topics that are being brought up there during these protests. This is, of course, from here in Australia, people combining all sorts of conspiracy theories and other hyperpartisan talking points ultimately to whip up sentiment for resistance against government policy, certainly in this case, and in order to drive further this kind of discord in society. In fact, we're seeing these sorts of studies being done as well. Even in, I can't quite see it from here, but I think it was May this year, still more than half of Republicans actually thought of Donald Trump as their true president. So this is a sign of deep polarization in society. Clearly, if you'd asked Democrats, you'd get a very different result. And that means that we ultimately see different parts, certainly of US society, who live in very different worlds by now, essentially. This is really what these kinds of stats, what these kinds of surveys seem to be telling us. Now, we need to take all of this with a certain grain of salt, of course. These are momentary snapshots, and all of this depends on how these surveys are being done and so on. So we shouldn't read too much into any one individual data point, but as we put these together, we see clearly some obvious and significant and lasting evidence of polarization of hyperpartisanship in US society in this case, but again, we see similar data, similar views being expressed in a number of other societies around the world as well. So what's going on here? What is driving this? What is driving this polarization? What is driving this slide towards greater and greater partisan division, as it may be? Well, some answers seem to be that this is driven by technology. Here, this is from the farewell speech by Barack Obama in 2017. And amongst a number of other topics that he talked about, he felt it important enough to say that, in his view, people are retreating into their own bubbles. They're locking themselves away in their communities and their neighborhoods, or as he says, they're especially in their social media feeds. So this has become a very common trope of these discussions, of course. Why are we getting more polarized? Why are we descending into these hyper-partisan communities that no longer speak to each other? Well, maybe it's got something to do with technology, maybe it's social media, maybe it's the platforms, maybe it's the platform algorithms that are pushing us into these communities and are disconnecting us from each other, our communities from each other. And this is, of course, the filter bubble or echo chamber argument. The gentleman up there is the entrepreneur and tech activist Eli Pariser, who introduced the idea of the filter bubble and essentially said, well, you know, as people are searching for the same information, maybe the search engines are giving them different results. So suddenly, if that happens all the time, we're no longer living in the same reality. We are actually getting very different information on the same topic based on what these search engines think about us, what they know about us, who they think we are, what kinds of interests they think we have. So is it as easy as blaming our platforms, our algorithms? The echo chamber argument works in a very similar way, but ultimately with different technologies. So the echo chamber argument might be more around the social media feeds and their algorithms shaping different realities for us. Your Facebook news feed looks different from my Facebook news feed, and therefore we end up in different realities. That's the argument essentially being made here in a nutshell. It's the technology, it's the platforms, it's their algorithms that personalize information for us and therefore place us in very different environments. Now that might seem convincing to a certain extent, but unfortunately the evidence doesn't quite bear it up. Now this graph in itself may not mean all that much to you, and I'm really just showing it here as an example of some of the work that is being done here, in part also by us in the Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, as well as by a number of other research groups around the world. We have a project currently in the field that asks Australian users to donate their search results for certain topics so that we can see what results different people across society are seeing. And what this graph is meant to symbolize, and I haven't got the time to go in detail here, but what this graph essentially is trying to tell us is that the search results that people see for a given topic actually end up being quite similar, very similar in fact, and very stable. So different people from different walks of life with different interests, with different backgrounds, from different locations, actually see pretty much the same results on many topics. And there is therefore no filter bubble in the way that it's been traditionally described. This research that we've done is also backed up by research that other people have done around the world with these kinds of approaches, with other kinds of methods where they set up fake accounts and are searching from those accounts. But essentially, the evidence that we see from search is that there are no filter bubbles, that by and large, different people still see very much the same results, at least on a search engine like Google. So that should give us pause in trying to blame simply the platforms themselves for this slide towards hyperpartisanship and polarization. This is, by the way, what our project looks like. If you're interested in becoming part of it and donating some of your own search results, then this is where you go, admscenter.org.au/search experience. We'd love to have you on board and donate some data for us as well. But so on search, we're not seeing evidence of the platforms actually giving us very different results at this point. The same goes for social media as well. This is work that we've done here in the Digital Media Research Center some years ago when we mapped the follower relationships in the Australian Twitter sphere. And we tried to identify, well, how connected or disconnected is the Australian Twitter sphere? We went through it and identified the kinds of clusters that we see in the network. And we see ultimately from this that by and large, yes, there are different interests. There are different interest communities in the Australian Twitter sphere, but they're still very thoroughly connected with each other as well. So again, in social media, in this particular social media, but also in many others, we're not seeing evidence that people are kind of hermetically sealing themselves away in echo chambers, in groups that are disconnected from the rest of the world. Most people still see a lot of information that cuts across political and other boundaries. If you fervently believe in a certain thing, or if you fervently follow a particular political party or political leader, it doesn't mean that you're only seeing information that's favorable to that party or leader. There is ultimately very, very little empirical evidence for the existence of filter bubbles or echo chambers. And in fact, that's a book I've published a couple of years ago on this. And ultimately, I come to the same conclusion as the German journalist Sebastian Meineck, excuse me, who says that the idea of the filter bubble, or the term filter bubble itself, is the dumbest metaphor on the internet, quite simply. So we don't see evidence that it's the platforms, it's the technologies. We can certainly find many reasons to blame Facebook and Twitter and Google and other platforms for other things. They're not perfect and they're not blameless, but the idea that they disconnect us, that they put us in different informational environments, actually is one of the things that probably are least likely developments, least likely results of us using them. There are many other problems with them, but this is not one of them. So if it's not that, then what? To some extent, actually, we can turn this around. We can get away from the idea that these platforms are disconnecting us from each other, that they are giving us different informational environments in which we operate. In fact, part of the problem here might be connectivity, might be connection, might be the way that they make it easier for people to find the information that they're interested in and to explore all sorts of other alternative views. This is actually from the same protest that I showed you earlier. This is a wonderful or threatening or worrying example. A whole shopping list, I think, of conspiracy theories here being brought together by this lady, all the way from QAnon and related conspiracy theories all the way through to the Illuminati and everything else. So this is actually an example of connectivity. This is not a person who is disconnected and in a filter bubble. This is a person who, well, who probably would say she's done her research. She's certainly searched a lot. She's found a lot of information, a lot of alternative views all over the internet and put them all together there in her poster. So in some ways, these hyper partisans, these people who have drifted off to the fringes of political discourse and debate, are the ones who have consumed perhaps the most varied amount of information and picked from this what they believed in, what they felt was most supportive of their views or most interesting to them. So these technologies, ultimately, if we want to blame technologies, then we need to blame them for their ability to connect us, not to disconnect us. And to enable people like this, enable people who are curious about conspiracy theory content to find it more easily, find it more readily, connect with the communities that exist around this kind of content as well. But of course, we might say the same also about much more socially productive and positive connections. So these same technologies, yes, enable hyperpartisans to find each other, but they also enable people to find each other who have a genuine need to be connected for mutual support. In some ways, of course, hyperpartisans use these technologies just as much for mutual support as a community of whatever you want to name it, a minority community, a community of disabled users, or anyone else might come together using these technologies when they find it much more difficult to come together in a physical form. So ultimately, these are technologies of connectivity, of coming together, of engaging with each other, and they can be used for good as much as bad, for socially productive as well as socially destructive purposes if we want to use these kinds of value judgments. And in this particular case, of course, there is simply here a community of connection, but around conspiracy theories that's going on. So I think what's really happening here, and I'm much more here with the internet pioneer, I guess you could say, David Weinberger, who says that the problem with an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list is not that it's an echo chamber. It's not that it's a mailing list. It's the problem. The problem here is that it thinks that there is a conspiracy of extraterrestrials. In much the same way we can say now today that, you know, the problem here that we're experiencing is not that there are technologies that enable echo chambers, filter bubbles, they enable hyperparticles to drift off into their own networks where they never see any information that points in any other direction. The problem is simply that these groups of conspiracy theorists exist, that people have these outlandish views and are perhaps feeling more and more free to express these perspectives. And this is obviously an example of what's now really being called do your own research. So more and more people are enabled to do this kind of work. And I'm showing this really here just as an example of the discussions that are now being had, perhaps ironically on a show on CNN called Reliable Sources, because many of the people who do their own research would probably not find that CNN for them is a reliable source. But we are seeing essentially more and more people who are willing to say, well, I'll just do my own research. I no longer trust the mainstream media. I no longer trust experts. I no longer trust academics. I no longer trust anyone else. I'm just going to find the information that I believe in wherever I can find it, be it on some obscure conspiracist forum. And in some ways, really, what this is doing is weaponizing media literacy. Here, I'm showing you a fact sheet from Britannica. If you remember Britannica, it's what we used to have when we didn't have Wikipedia, who are basically telling people how to do their own research, of course. Now, a lot of this is perfectly well intended and is, of course, trying to train people in media literacy. But with a different system of coordinates, a conspiracy theorist would very much agree with all of this. Now, my screen's too far away, so I apologize if I have to turn around. Choose your sources widely. Yes, of course, a conspiracy theorist would say that. Don't trust CNN, don't trust the ABC, trust Breitbart and InfoWars. Proceed with caution. Be skeptical when people are saying that we're all going to die because of global warming or that COVID-19 is really dangerous. Someone like that might say, well, yeah, really? Maybe not. Maybe this is all just a hoax. Trust expertise, yes, but the problem is which experts. So again, a conspiracy theorist might just say, well, I'm not trusting all of these academics and government people. I'm trusting someone who pretends to be a professor and claims to know all the things that there are to know about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, and so on. So in many ways, really, the language of media literacy is being used by these conspiracy theorists, by these hyperpartisans, just as much as it is being used by people in the mainstream of society. The problem in many ways is really that coordinate system, what to trust, who the experts are. And the people on the fringes, the people in these hyperpartisan communities are essentially just replacing one set of experts, one set of trusted voices with another. But they're using very much the same approach to critiquing, criticizing, debunking the sources that they don't trust. Now, this is deeply problematic, in part also because media literacy in itself is already not particularly well developed. This is work that colleagues of mine here in the Digital Media Research Center, as well as at Western Sydney University, have done, who are clearly showing that Australian children, for instance, are not learning enough about media literacy. Now, we could say much the same thing about Australian adults and Australian senior citizens as well, because in those groups, media literacy is not necessarily much better developed either. And there have been studies of seniors in Australia, for instance, as well, that show very similar patterns too. So we have a problem with media literacy, but ultimately this needs to go beyond just simply training or teaching the mechanics of media literacy, but also needs to help people understand what to look for, what kinds of sources perhaps to not believe in, but which kind of sources are more trustworthy than others. And all of this is, of course, further problematized and further undermined ultimately by the really substantial amount of alternative content that is now circulating. So here, I'm not really expecting you to read that much into this graph itself, but this is from work that we're currently doing in an ARC discovery project in the Digital Media Research Center, looking at the circulation of what we call fake news content, but what really is a range of mis and disinformation sources on Facebook. And we're seeing a whole galaxy ultimately of Facebook pages and groups that they're posting this content, they're sharing it with each other, that are linking to these sites right across different themes right across different languages and countries as well. So this is a global effort of disseminating mis and disinformation that we're now seeing, not just on Facebook. I'm really just showing you this because this is the most recent work that we've done, but this exists obviously on many other platforms just as much. We zoom in, we see all the usual suspects, for instance, in the cluster around US conservatives. Of course, Donald Trump is there as well, as are groups like Breitbart and others. But we're also seeing some very obvious state actors there. So the Russian state propaganda channels RT and Sputnik, for instance, are also very prominent, are oddly aligned with particular interests as well. We see RT and Sputnik pop up, for instance, around holistic medicine and alternative health pages as well, where they seem to have a way to infiltrate them with their information. Just yesterday, in fact, I heard that the German channels of RT were taken off YouTube because they were sharing COVID-19 mis and disinformation. So there is some action, at least, against some of these sources, but this is also business, and this is also, of course, a state enterprise in many cases. Speaking of business, we have also done work recently on the dissemination of videos from Sky News Australia, and while I don't want to ascribe any agency necessarily to Sky News itself, we do note that Sky News content, yes, circulates amongst Australian political pages and groups on Facebook, but also amongst the large number of very fringe and hyper-partisan groups in the US that were often in support of the insurrection on the 6th of January at the Capitol. And in fact, amongst a much more diffuse network of COVID-19 denialists, believers in a global conspiracy to depopulate the earth, and all sorts of other strange conspiracy theories. So as a commercial enterprise, I think this should give anyone pause about where their content is circulating, what kinds of communities are picking up on this. So these are the kinds of observations that we can quite easily make, of course, with the tools at our disposal to see what these groups are, what kind of content they engage with, where they get their information from, and really ultimately to what extent this has become also a business of publishing mis, dis, or simply alternative information, and to what extent that might also be driven by nefarious interests such as state interests in Russia or elsewhere. So the problem here is also, and again, this gets us away from this idea that it's just the social media platforms. The problem here is also that social, fringe, and mainstream media outlets are quite densely and intensely interconnected. We see this over and over again. A study that we did last year on the spread of the conspiracy theory that linked COVID-19 to 5G mobile technology. Of course, there is absolutely no connection whatsoever, but that hasn't stopped them from claiming it. Showed that from some very humble origins in obscure French blogs through German language alternative medicine sites to finally celebrities who were starting to spread this information in English language, to well, again, celebrities who are making strange statements on YouTube, and then finally into British tabloids. It really just took a few months for this information to travel this far. So there is a very direct throughput from the very obscure fringes of conspiracy theorists all the way into mainstream tabloids in the UK. And this again should give us, I think, pause and should make us worry about the ease with which this damaging and ultimately harmful information can travel from its very obscure origins into mass circulation. Partly, it has to be said, this is a failure of journalism as well, unfortunately, particularly on the part of celebrity and tabloid journalism, where for institutional as well as economic reasons, perhaps the standards of journalism are often not as high as they are in hard news and political journalism, where jobs are more precarious and where there is a very substantial pressure to simply get eyeballs on news articles, of course. So in these cases particularly, there isn't a great deal of fact-checking or a great deal of reflection on the harm that sharing celebrities mouthing off about conspiracy theories might actually do to readers, to audiences, to the general public, if they take these things at face value. So this again is I think for me a really important indication that this isn't just about any one platform, any one technology. This is really about the media sphere much more broadly. This is much more about the interconnectedness of the media ecology and of information streams within it. So it's wonderful to see. Actually, I want to give a shout out here to First Draft as well, who are doing media literacy training essentially, not just for general audiences, but also for journalists. Because I think there is also there quite a need, particularly again in some of these news organizations that are perhaps more on the tabloid and mass circulation end of things. It is really critical for journalists, and it's very difficult, unfortunately, also for journalists, particularly in the context of a global pandemic where there is an avalanche of breaking news every day, to reflect on what the impact of their reporting is, what the impact of their giving a platform to people with obscure and damaging, harmful views is. And there's a need to be a lot more cautious, I think, about promoting perhaps concerns about vaccines or ideas about alternative treatments and so on. That needs to happen. Now, one of the questions I started out with was, is it actually getting worse? And that, oddly enough, is still very much an open question. It seems to be getting worse, perhaps from anecdotal evidence, from our own observations. Yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so objectively it's worse than not being in the middle of a pandemic. But is the spread of mis and disinformation, is the polarization of societies, is that all getting worse? And that's not quite so easy to say. It may be easy to say for the US, and the Pew Research Center has done some interesting longitudinal work here that shows a drift apart from between Republicans and Democrats over these, 20-odd years. So in this particular case, yes, perhaps we can say the US certainly has been getting worse. It has been getting worse for some time. In fact, well before Twitter and Facebook came on the scene, certainly. But can we say more about this? What actually, when we say getting worse, by what count or by what metric, on what dimensions? How can we actually measure polarization? And that is actually one of the key challenges that I'm looking to address with my laureate fellowship as well. So first off, perhaps we can say, well, what's the polarization in news coverage? What are the different news outlets doing? How are they covering the world? And how different perhaps are their views? So to what extent do we have a bifurcation into far right, far left, centrist, whatever news outlets? And this might look quite convincing in some way, certainly for a US context. This is a graph that some of you might have seen that's been going around for some time, trying to place basically different news outlets in the US on a kind of left-right, Democrat-Republican scale. The problem with this is that this is basically based on the reckons of a very small team of market analysts. I guess I'm using that term quite loosely here. This is not scholarly research. It's not based really on any kind of formal and rigorous analysis. This is more kind of pinning a bunch of news outlets' logos on a board and kind of producing something that seems reasonably convincing. So there isn't a lot of really systematic analysis of the level of polarization in news content, in news coverage itself. We have some better evidence, and here from Australia, on the polarization or otherwise of news audiences. This is from the Digital News Report Australia, produced by the University of Canberra, which is essentially self-reported data from news audiences, from a representative sample of news audiences around Australia, about their own political positioning and the news outlets that they consume. And well, we see an obvious outlier there with Sky News perhaps being quite far to the right and everything else clustering much more around the middle. The middle is indicated by that dashed line. Something odd with this though, this is the offline news brands. When you look at the online news brands, it looks quite different, and Sky News is sort of somewhere middle of the road. So that I think needs some more explanation and some more interpretation. Maybe there is also simply a bifurcation between people who consume their news online and offline these days. Of course, online news consumers, well, let me put it the other way, offline news consumers, the people who are still buying newspapers and watching TV news or listening to radio news are getting pretty long in the tooth. People who consume news online tend to be younger audiences. So maybe this is what we're seeing there, that older consumers are more conservative. But I think, again, this needs more interpretation, more understanding. And it also really needs, in order to answer whether this is getting worse or not, or whether there's more polarization or not, we need, of course, more data points. We need to track this over a number of years and understand how this positioning might change, whether this is just fluctuating from year to year, or whether there is a genuine and ongoing drift, perhaps, of audiences towards the fringes or away from each other. So more work is certainly required to be done there. Another way to approach this might be engagement with the news, not just news audiencing, not just reading, watching, consuming the news, but actually engaging by sharing, by commenting, by retweeting, by everything else. This is again from the US. And you see there already that we have all of these kind of individual data points, but not necessarily anything that does any systematic comparison across countries or across years. So here in the US, this is supporters of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the election before last, and the news outlets that they're retweeting. So clearly, Clinton followers and Trump followers retweet very different news, very different information. Maybe that shouldn't surprise us. Maybe it's always been thus. So is this actually a significant sign of polarization, or is it just a sign that, yes, there are two candidates and they have different followers and different policies? So again, we'd need to track this over multiple election cycles to really understand the extent to which this is just the state of play in the US, or it's getting worse, getting better possibly. And then we might also look more broadly at public discourse, particularly perhaps on social media, because that's where a lot of public discourse is these days. And by that, I mean discourse amongst the actual public rather than discourse amongst talking heads on TV or in newspapers. So we could also look at the polarization of public discourse around certain topics online. And here I want to give a shout out to my colleague Ehsan Dehan, who's done some fantastic work looking at a number of recent Australian political controversies on Twitter in this case. And again, we need to go beyond individual platforms. But he found, for instance, that there were clear signs of polarization in the discourse around the 18C debate. This was the debate to change the laws on anti-discrimination to, as George Brandes, I think, said, let bigots be bigots. So in that debate, he saw very clear evidence of polarization with people who were associated with the hard right in Australia, engaging mainly amongst themselves, and much of the rest of the conversation happening somewhere else. But on an equally controversial, maybe even more controversial topic like robo-debt, he saw no polarization whatsoever. Whether you were right or left or anywhere in between, you were very critical of the robo-debt program. So polarization is not necessarily constant, is not necessarily stable. It might be highly issue dependent as well. And groups that otherwise might hate each other's guts basically might well unite on certain topics if a particular government policy or something else might just not agree with them fundamentally. And this has, I think, been the case certainly with robo-debt. So we're seeing these kinds of very divergent patterns. And again, this to me means that there is a need to study more of these kinds of cases across more platforms over longer periods of time, and to understand, well, is this actually getting worse? Is it very issue dependent? Is it very topic dependent? And maybe is it also very platform dependent, of course? So this is, I think, what needs to be done. And this is really my agenda for the next 5 years of this laureate fellowship as well. Here are the kinds of things we need to do. We need to, in the first place, I think, approach this from a very multidisciplinary perspective. So we need better measures of polarization across these different dimensions. We don't have a huge amount of this. We have very different methodologies and approaches to understanding and very different definitions of polarization in the first place, I guess. So that needs to be done. We need to find better ways of actually assessing polarization other than just our general kind of feel opinions about how badly things are going in society and how much people aren't talking to each other anymore. We need to assess these over time as well. I think in order to really understand, well, has the US just always been polarized, or is it getting worse? Is it getting worse or better in Australia? We need to, of course, track this over a much longer term to really understand, these patterns and see what the trends are. Maybe there's an ebb and flow there as well. We need to, I think, also very much compare this across different political and media systems. I've shown you here mainly examples from the US and Australia, but obviously these two systems aren't the same. And the results in either system can't easily be compared with each other. The US has a presidential system. It's a heavily polarized, ultimately two-party system, of course. The Australian system is a parliamentary system. It's not working in quite the same way. We don't elect our prime ministers directly. We don't elect a head of state at all. So there are many differences there to the way the Australian political system works. We also have compulsory voting, by the way, which also changes the extent to which you can simply alienate the other side and get your own side out to vote and hope to be elected. Here, you need to work with the swinging middle and get them on side in order to win government, as many parties in Australia have found to their misfortune. So we need to understand the impact of these different political systems better. Highly consensus-based European systems, again, work very differently, where you've got multi-party coalitions that form, for instance. And of course, the media systems also come into play. If you've got a fairly impoverished media system, as we arguably got in Australia, where we've got just a very small handful of major news companies, and you compare that with a really rich and diverse media system, as many European countries have it, as well, the US to some extent has it, but minus the strong public broadcaster. Again, these political debates and polarization, hyperpartisanship work out very differently there too. We need to, again, just understand this also on an issue-by-issue basis, not just as a left to right polarization. In a number of countries or a number of issues, left and right doesn't really come into it at all. Brexit in the UK wasn't a left versus right issue. It was a Leavers versus Remainers issue, and you could find Leavers and Remainers just as easily in the Labour Party as in the Conservative Party. So with all of these things, we need to understand better what and where we find polarization, how we might be able to measure it. And that ultimately requires a bunch of disciplines to work together as well. My field is media and communication studies, so of course I'm listing that first. And we have many approaches to understanding the public sphere, or rather the publics that exist in society and that interact and engage with each other in society. So understanding these groups, these communities, these audiences and how they overlap and interact and interconnect with each other, understanding the role of platforms in enabling these kinds of connections and interactions. All of that is something that media and communication studies can provide. The computational extension, or the marriage, sometimes uneven marriage between communication studies and computational work, helps us to do this at scale as well. So particularly when we talk about digital communications media, social media, there is now a great deal of data that sometimes we have access to, sometimes we don't, that we can use to understand better the patterns of communication around particular issues, around particular topics, in particular contexts, and so on, track that over time and so on. So this enables us to do this work on a large scale, and then dive deep and qualitatively deep into individual cases as well. So that's necessary, the computational side of this. More and more, I'm kind of drawn back to the psychological component here as well, because to me, again, seeing that it's not the filter bubbles, it's not the echo chambers, it's not that some technology is disconnecting us from each other, but it is actually that some people simply come to a debate already with a fixed mindset that under no circumstances is going to be changed. That's a psychological question. How have they built that filter in their heads if there isn't a filter bubble in their platforms? What is it that's driven that psychological trend towards hyperpartisanship, towards a belief in conspiracy theories and so on. And finally, of course, a lot of this ultimately deals with politics as well. It needn't always be about politics. There are other forms of polarization, of course, as well, and they're just as important and possibly just as damaging. Polarization around vaccines, for instance, is not necessarily simply a political issue. But political science ultimately has a lot to say about this as well. And of course, it might remind us perhaps as well that polarization in itself, that partisanship in itself is not always simply a bad thing and something to be avoided. We wouldn't have political parties if there wasn't partisanship, obviously. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Okay, but we wouldn't have any kind of contest of ideas if there wasn't some degree of polarization, if there wasn't some degree of partisanship, obviously, in society. So a mild form of polarization, a mild form of partisanship can be very productive, can be very generative of new ideas. This is not about kind of just pushing everyone towards the middle and saying everyone needs to have the same ideas, but it is about avoiding the extremes of hyperpartisanship and hyperpolarization that ultimately disconnect us from each other. So that's my agenda for this laureate. For those of you who are interested, if there's anyone out there who's interested in embarking on a postdoctoral fellowship, starting a PhD, there are opportunities there coming up. So please get in touch. And otherwise, I hope we have a little bit of time for discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel, for those insights. And thank you to the people online who've been posting very thoughtful questions throughout. So for our people in the auditorium, if you have a question you'd like to ask now, please raise your hand and a microphone will find its way to you.
And just while we're waiting for the microphones to come across, I might throw in one of the online questions straight away.
Thank you.
So we've got Christy asking, given the intensity of this disinformation and polarization of content coming at the cost of undermining trust in information, how can people or organizations measure trust?
It's a very good question. It's a very difficult question that I don't necessarily have an easy answer to. Let me see where I start on this one. The intensity of mis and disinformation circulating is obviously a really significant problem. I think in the first place, for us, for all of us, there is a need to counteract, to speak up, to engage and arrest the circulation of that content when we see it. I think that's maybe one of the first steps here. So as we see damaging mis and disinformation, for instance, that circulates about the appropriate responses to COVID-19, about wonder drugs that ultimately are going to harm rather than help us. It's important to use the tools available to us to speak to others and try to convince them to stop sharing this kind of stuff if we feel comfortable doing so. Of course, some people end up getting very irate and aggressive when they're being told to stop it. So I'm not saying everyone needs to do this all the time, but also to use the reporting tools available on social platforms, for instance, to respond and to engage, to make it more difficult. And of course, I guess the other thing is just not to share things on when you're not sure about the content that you're seeing. That to me, so all of us have a role to play in delaying, I guess, the circulation of this kind of content. But also, it comes back ultimately to some of those points about media literacy that I made. We need to all be very cautious about the sources that we engage with and whose content we share, and not just share things on because our weird uncle on Facebook has shared things or someone else. So that's, I think, one of the steps. But there is a much longer answer there that would take me some time to formulate, I think.
Thank you. A next question. One of our fabulous EMBA students.
G'day, Axel. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I had a question about bias and about, you talked about polarization from a left and right perspective. have you had, I know there are sort of topic by topic issues that might have polarization, but in terms of worldview, do you see other dimensions that are a bit more universal that bias can be measured on?
Quite possibly. I mean, at a societal level, I guess, and I'm not quite sure if that's quite what you've got in mind, but at a societal level, of course, there are perhaps different levels of different leanings on a simple left-right scale, simple conservative-progressive scale. Some of what's mainstream in the US, for instance, would be seen as quite far right here in Australia. Some of what's mainstream in Europe, for instance, would be seen as far left in the US. So the coordinate systems in different countries are quite different to begin with, I think. And that's a kind of a societal bias, perhaps, and perhaps driven by histories of these countries, driven by other factors as well. So there is a distinction there between different local societal systems as well. Of course, there's also perhaps inherent bias that might exist in media organizations, in media platforms, social media platforms as well. So that's also important to understand. There are, again, this goes back maybe to that first dimension that I've talked about as well, of trying to see whether particular media outlets are always spinning things in a certain way, or always reporting in a certain way, which actually, going back to the question of trust, of course, might also undermine trust in them. So for some of them, it may not be a particularly sensible strategy to be seen as biased in a certain way. It might attract a particular audience, but it might also disconnect them from a potentially much bigger audience elsewhere. So, but these kinds of questions are, again, very difficult, of course, to assess, and very controversial, of course, as well, because any media organization that's being told you're leaning to the left or you're leaning to the right is probably going to say, well, no, you're the one who's leaning to the left or the right. So we've got to be very sure that we have the evidence to make these claims about these media organizations.
Axel, congratulations again. This is such an amazing project, so pressing, so urgent. I want to ask you about those 4 research frameworks and the elements in there. So you mentioned, I think, media comms, computational, psychological, and the political. Mm-hmm. It strikes me that a lot of what you've discussed also has an economic dimension. And I think you even alluded to it, like the eyeballs on clickbait and so forth. So is there somewhere in the laureate program the question around why the polarization makes so much money?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I should say these dimensions, or these disciplines, I guess, are by no means exclusive. You're right, economy, political economy would come into this as well. History also is, I think, a discipline that also has something to offer. Again, you know, some of the historical factors that might lead to certain levels of pre-existing polarization or certain political leanings in particular societies. But yes, I think there is absolutely a space to understand, well, to at least interpret and understand the levels of polarization that you might see based on the economic pressures that some of these outlets or some of these industries are under, the need to find eyeballs for articles and so on, as you're saying. So yes, the economic side of this certainly has an impact as well. And we're seeing also, of course, that some of the outright disinformation operations that have been identified are ultimately not driven so much by any strong political persuasion or agenda, but simply because you can also make good money out of advertising. You know, at this point, well, I was going to say at this point, I'm not sure that InfoWars really still believes in what it does. It probably still does, but some of these organizations like InfoWars have become really successful business enterprises as well, who are selling, you know, energy supplements on the side or whatever. So some of them are really, you know, in it for the money just as much as they might be in it for any kind of political aims. Yeah.
Hi, Axel. Thank you. Super interesting. I had a question about where you think as you mentioned, that right and left isn't the only kind of dimensions we want to be looking at polarization on, whether you had a sense of some of the fault lines, like what the fault lines might be. I'm thinking you mentioned Brexit. There's been a lot of discussion about whether it's around education levels and how that drives feelings towards Brexit or age, where you think some of those key kind of variables might be.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider these sorts of examples. Brexit is one where, yeah, it's clearly about, well, it's, again, maybe it's history, maybe it's something else, but there's a difference in sentiment towards the EU and towards supranational organizations, and perhaps more broadly as well, that's underlying the Brexit debate, or underlay the Brexit debate. With the debate about, vaccination and so on, we're seeing some very strange bedfellows as well, where we've got anti-vaxxers who are driven by some fairly kind of broadly hippie-ish kind of views about vaccination generally, to people on the very far right fringes of society who believe that this is all some sort of world government depopulation agenda, and they are quite happy to shake hands and come together to protest against vaccines. So it is really interesting to see these really odd bedfellows coming together, and there are possibly, as you're saying, educational dimension, there might be socioeconomic dimension, there might be regional, local, location, geographic dimensions, I guess. There may be, again, there might be historical dimensions as well about this. So some of these other aspects, these other factors, which are being explored, certainly in the case of Brexit, in the case of some of these other cross-political divides, are being explored by people doing, surveys and psychological studies and whatever. I think it'd be very interesting to see what kinds of factors they show up, and what might need to be factored into these kinds of divisions.
Ladies and gentlemen, very, very sorry if we haven't got to your questions, but I know that we are holding up these people who have a dinner to get to, so we will move on. But please, if you have further questions that you'd like to raise, please contact us after the event, because I know that we will be in continued communication with Axel, and we'll be able to pass those on. So what an intellectual feast. Thank you so much. If we revisit some of the emerging themes, the word Twittersphere is now a legitimate noun. Somewhere out there, apparently, exists a thing called an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list. And whilst information literacy has always been equated with power, it is now becoming weaponized with huge human impact. So will our children of the future have compulsory core curriculum around media literacy? Probably. Will the future bring much more investment, needed investment in quality research, to address all of the issues that Axel has raised? Hopefully. And do we need to see more intentional ethical decision-making by journalists into the future? Definitely. Here at QUT, impactful research, ethical decision-making, systems thinking, they're in our DNA. If you would like to find any more about those things, please contact us after the event. When will we see you again? Our next Real World Futures event is scheduled for November, and we'll be in communication with you soon about the topic for that, but it promises to be, again, very exciting. Until we see you again, take care wherever you are this evening. Have a good one. Good night.